On the 10th of June 1940, Italian dictator Benito Mussolini finally joined Hitler in war against Britain and France. The Italian invasion of the French Riviera 2 days before the French surrender made virtually no progress, but as his fruits of victory, Mussolini gained occupation of this region. But Mussolini also wanted to deal Britain a blow against her naval influence in the Mediterranean. Here the British had 3 main naval bases. In the west was Gibraltar, which they had captured from the Spanish in 1704. Malta, traditional home of the Mediterranean fleet, covered the central Mediterranean and the Egyptian port of Alexandria, the east. Mussolini was jealous and determined to make the Mediterranean his sea. To face the British, his navy had its main bases at Taranto, La Spezia and Messina. It was, on paper at least, a match for the British. What, however, made the Mediterranean so crucial to the British was the Suez Canal. Constructed in the 1870s, with French backing as well, it had dramatically cut the sailing time from Britain to India and the Far East. Threatening the canal on land were 250,000 Italian troops in Libya and a further 100,000 in Abyssinia, Eritrea and Italian Somaliland. To oppose them, the British had a mere 60,000 men, mainly based in Egypt and Palestine. With small garrisons in Sudan, British Somaliland and Aden. There was too an important air base in Iraq at Habbaniyah. To show that they meant business, the Italians bombed Malta, Aden and Port Sudan on the 11th of June. The British deployed troops to the Egyptian-Libyan frontier, expecting an Italian attack, and began to carry out raids across the border. The Italian attack would take time to materialize and was not helped by the death of the Italian Governor-General, Marshal Italo Balbo, a distinguished airman whose aircraft was shot down by one of his own planes. For the Royal Navy, the most important objective was to keep Malta supplied, even though it was within easy range of Italian aircraft operating from Sicily. But French Northwest Africa complicated matters. Much of the French fleet had fled here, and on the 3rd of July 1940, the Royal Navy attacked it, fearful that it would fall into German hands. Ships were destroyed and French sailors killed and wounded. Vichy French anger at this was manifested in bombing attacks against Gibraltar by aircraft based in northwest Africa. However, these raids caused little damage. At sea, the Italians began to attack British supply convoys to Malta, with both ships and aircraft. This led to a number of naval clashes. On land, Italian forces seized 2 frontier posts in Sudan in early July, and then quickly overran British Somaliland, forcing the British garrison to evacuate to Aden. But in August 1940, and in spite of the threat of invasion of Britain itself, Churchill sent a fast convoy of tanks through the Mediterranean to reinforce Egypt. This was as well. In mid-September, the long-awaited Italian invasion of Egypt began, but halted after a 60-mile advance. One reason for this was because Mussolini wanted to bring the Balkans under his sway. At the end of October 1940, his troops invaded neutral Greece from Italian-occupied Albania. It was a bad mistake. The Greeks not only resisted, but counterattacked, overrunning half of Albania before the year's end. At sea, the struggle to keep Malta supplied continued in the face of Italian air and naval opposition. But on the night of the 11th of November 1940, British Swordfish aircraft took off from the carrier Illustrious and made a daring torpedo attack on the Italian naval base at Taranto. They severely crippled 3 battleships. This made the Italian Navy more cautious, but naval clashes continued. Meanwhile, in Egypt, British reinforcements had arrived from Australia and India. An operation was planned to destroy the Italian camps inside Egypt. This was launched late on the 8th of December. The troops at first thought that they were on maneuvers. The assault caught the Italians by surprise. Within 2 weeks, the Italians had been driven back into Libya. Archibald Wavell, the British commander-in-chief, decided to build on this success by launching a full-scale invasion of the Italian colony. Early in January 1941, the port of Bardia fell to the Australians, followed by Tobruk and Derna. The Australians continued along the coast road towards Benghazi, while the tanks raced inland, aiming to cut off the Italians as they withdrew from Benghazi. After driving through difficult terrain, the tanks arrived just in time. Pressed by the Australians in the north, the Italians were unable to escape. Eventually, 20,000 Italians were made prisoner in this one engagement. "200 guns and 120 tanks were seized in addition to the large amounts of weaponry and 110,000 prisoners captured since the start of the offensive. It was a spectacular victory, but one that would be short-lived. Wavell was already waging a parallel campaign in the south with the aim of removing the Italian presence from East Africa. This consisted of 4 separate thrusts. From Sudan, 2 Indian divisions advanced into Eritrea. They fought a very tough campaign in rugged country before securing the colony in May 1941. The Abyssinian Emperor Haile Selassie led an indigenous force to reclaim his throne from the Italians. Selassie's men also set out from Sudan. Another force of South, East and West African troops invaded Italian Somaliland from Kenya. Finally, troops crossed from Aden to liberate British Somaliland. But even while these campaigns were underway, Wavell's slender and widely spread forces were being further stretched. Churchill's eye had alighted on Greece and her fight against the Italians. In March 1941, he ordered Wavell to send forces to help this new ally. British strength in Libya was seriously weakened, just as a new threat was appearing. For Hitler had dispatched a small German force under General Erwin Rommel. He was keen to take advantage of the British weakness and, in spite of Italian objections, quickly deployed his forces to the Cyrenaica border. Rommel's Africa Corps spearheaded the Axis attack, which opened on the 24th of March and quickly sent the British reeling back into Egypt, with just the port of Tobruk holding out against them. Worse was to follow. Hitler was now planning to invade Russia. In order to secure his southern flanks, he had managed to coerce most Balkan states onto his side. At the end of March, following a coup d'etat, Yugoslavia broke ranks. A furious Hitler invaded it, and Greece, on the 6th of April 1941. It was a classic blitzkrieg campaign, swift and decisive. The Yugoslav forces were ill-prepared to face such an onslaught and were quickly overrun. The Germans entered the capital, Belgrade, on the 12th of April, and Yugoslavia surrendered 5 days later. Greece lasted little longer, the British contingent having to be evacuated by the Royal Navy. Indeed, the only gleam of light for the British was at sea. Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham managed to draw the Italian fleet into battle off Cape Matapan on the 28th of March, while it was attempting to intercept British convoys to Greece. It was the first fully fledged fleet versus fleet battle of the Second World War. The British sank 3 cruisers and crippled a battleship. This kept the Italian fleet in port for the next few months. But on the 20th of May 1941, the Germans launched a daring airborne attack on the eastern Mediterranean island of Crete, south of Greece. British troops had been stationed here since November 1940, and men evacuated from Greece had helped to swell the garrison. There was some desperate fighting, especially around the island's airfields. But the German paratroops managed to secure these, and reinforcements were flown in. The Germans now began to drive the British towards the south coast of the island. The British rearguards were unable to hold back the German advance for long. Although they fought a number of stiff actions, they were continually outflanked. Once more, the Royal Navy had to be called in to evacuate the troops. Even so, many were left behind. It was another spectacular German success, but the loss of transport aircraft meant that they would never again attempt another large-scale airborne attack. The loss of Crete and the fact that the Luftwaffe had now joined the Italians in attacking Malta meant that no longer could British convoys pass through the Mediterranean. They had to go round South Africa's Cape of Good Hope instead. Indeed, it was barely possible to get occasional convoys through to keep Malta supplied. Elsewhere, Wavell had to put down an Iraqi revolt, which threatened the Habanaya air base, and in June 1941 invaded Vichy French Syria. This was provoked by fears that the Luftwaffe would establish itself here. It took 5 weeks of often bitter fighting to subdue the Vichy French. In Libya, during May and June, Wavell made 2 abortive attacks against Rommel's defences on the Egyptian border. His failure to break through and lift the siege of Tobruk, which continued to hold out, brought about Wavell's replacement by Sir Claude Auchinleck. He spent the next few months building up what was to become the 8th Army for a major offensive which was to take place in November. This was in spite of the fact that Churchill constantly pressured him to attack earlier. Although Malta remained under constant air attack, British submarines like this and aircraft based on the island were effectively harrying Axis supply convoys crossing to North Africa. Auchinleck's long-awaited offensive, codenamed Crusader, opened on the 18th of November 1941. The first phase was marked by a protracted dogfight between the tanks of both sides, and for a week the outcome was in the balance as the British infantry fought their way towards Tobruk. At one point the British armour came under threat when Rommel struck deep into their rear before being forced to withdraw. The air forces of both sides also played their part, with the British Desert Air Force eventually establishing superiority over the battlefield. Finally, now short of fuel, Rommel was forced to pull back. Auchinleck's men linked up with the Tobruk garrison and raised the siege. Rommel's losses were heavy, and he pulled back to the Tripolitanian border. The Axis, however, denied the British the use of Benghazi as a port by sowing it with mines, thus stretching their supply lines. Furthermore, Rommel received additional tanks, and on the 21st of January 1942, just 2 weeks after he had completed his withdrawal, he thrust into Cyrenaica once more. The British fell back to a new defence line, west of Tobruk, which they had worked hard to strengthen. There was now a debate over strategy in the Axis camp. Rommel wanted to press on to the Suez Canal and built up his forces accordingly. But Albert Kesselring, his superior as commander-in-chief of the Southern Theatre, had other ideas. He and the Italians considered the early capture of Malta to secure the Axis supply lines as more important. He did, however, permit Rommel to advance as far as Tobruk. Rommel struck at the end of May 1942, preempting the British, who were also preparing an attack. He swung his armour round the British open desert flank. Desperate tank battles followed. After 3 weeks' intense fighting, the British began to fall back. Tobruk was isolated once more, but this time it fell after 3 days. Rommel pressed home his advantage as the British 8th Army withdrawal became a retreat. Auchinleck turned to face his adversary at El Alamein, the last defendable position before the Suez Canal. Its southern flank rested on the impassable Qattara depression, but there were still doubts over his ability to hold the Germans. Such was the British concern that the Mediterranean fleet left Alexandria for the Lebanese port of Beirut. On the 1st of July 1942, Rommel attacked. For a time, the situation was in the balance. But the Axis troops were tired after 5 weeks of intense fighting, and fuel was short. Thus, the British 8th Army was able to hold the attack. The British now tried to break through the Axis defences. Throughout most of July, the two sides punched at one another like two exhausted boxers, until eventually they retired to their corners, too drained to continue. Meanwhile, Malta continued to hold out, with an ever-rising loss of British ships in the constant effort to keep the island supplied. The island's people were also suffering from the endless attacks from the air. The island would later be awarded Britain's highest civil decoration for bravery, the George Cross. Concerned by the situation, Churchill now visited Egypt to assess matters for himself. He decided that a change of leadership was needed. Auchinleck was replaced by a new team: General Sir Harold Alexander, who would command the theatre, and General Bernard Montgomery, who took over the tired and baffled 8th Army. Monty, as he was nicknamed, soon impressed his dynamic and positive personality on his men. There would be no more withdrawals, he declared. Forewarned by Ultra, Britain's ability to crack the top-secret German Enigma codes, that Rommel was to attack again at the end of August, Montgomery easily repulsed him at the Battle of Alam Halfa. Convinced that a large superiority in men and material was essential for success, he began to prepare to break through the Axis lines and drive the Italians and Germans out of the whole of Libya. On the evening of the 23rd of October 1942, the 8th Army deployed to its battle positions. Every man knew exactly what his part in the battle was. This was part of Montgomery's command style. "900 guns began to pound the Axis lines, and the attack began. Unable to outflank the Axis defences, the 8th Army could only attack frontally. For the next 11 days, the British struggled desperately to drive a hole through Rommel's defences. Casualties mounted on both sides. Rommel's men clung on grimly, while the Desert Air Force unceasingly harried them. The British pressure was relentless, and eventually, on the 3rd of November, Rommel was forced to retreat, much of his equipment destroyed. Thousands of Axis prisoners fell into British hands. Montgomery's tanks followed up and tried to cut Rommel off. But bad weather and tactical skill enabled the surviving Axis forces to get away. Throughout the remainder of November and December, the British Eighth Army pursued its adversary through Libya. The British entered Tripoli on the 23rd of January 1943, and Rommel crossed into Tunisia. But the overall situation had now changed. Both he and the British were aware that a new African theatre of war had just opened. As the men of Montgomery's Eighth Army paraded in Tripoli to celebrate their victory over the Axis forces, few of them would have known that it was to be the last success enjoyed by British arms alone. With America now in the war, Roosevelt and Churchill had agreed that defeat of Germany would take precedence over Japan, but it took time to decide where to strike. Eventually, the American General Dwight D. Eisenhower was appointed to command an agreed offensive operation in the Mediterranean. With the British tying down Rommel in Egypt, the Allies had decided to strike at the Vichy French possessions of Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. An American force sailing from the United States would land at Casablanca. Another force would leave Scotland and pass through the Straits of Gibraltar. American troops would land at Oran, while an Anglo-American force landed at Algiers and advanced into Tunisia. The Vichy French forces were sizable, and the Americans conducted secret negotiations to ensure that their resistance would be no more than a gesture of defiance. The landings, codenamed Torch, took place on the 8th of November 1942, just after Montgomery had begun his pursuit of Rommel. Not only was Torch the first combined Anglo-American operation, but it also represented the first of many Allied amphibious landings. The French offered only token resistance at Casablanca and Oran. But at Algiers, the French contested the issue more fiercely. Even so, they sought an armistice after a few days. Then the British and Americans advanced into Tunisia. Torch caught the Axis powers by surprise, yet within 24 hours they had begun to fly troops into Tunisia, using these Me-323 Gigant transports, the largest load-carrying aircraft of World War II. The two sides now advanced towards one another and clashed in a series of engagements in the hilly Tunisian terrain. A British force managed to get within 20 miles of Tunis before it was forced to withdraw. By the new year, amid rain and cold winds, the front line ran roughly down Tunisia's central hilly spine. The Allied Air Force suffered especially from the mud. The Axis forces now began a series of probing attacks. Rommel's African veterans now joined the troops already in Tunisia. He prepared to attack the combat-inexperienced Americans in the Kasserine Pass in order to drive the Allies out of western Tunisia. He struck in mid-February 1943, making many Americans prisoner, but was halted by other Allied forces. Montgomery's Eighth Army was now entering Tunisia from the east, thus opening another front. Rommel now decided to turn on him. Forewarned by Ultra, the British ability to decipher German codes, Montgomery inflicted a bloody repulse on his tanks in early March 1943. Rommel, now a sick man, left North Africa. In western Tunisia, the Americans and British of the First Army continued to battle on. They had now been joined by a French corps. Montgomery, meanwhile, prepared to tackle the formidable Mareth Line. The Allied air forces prepared the way, pounding the Axis defences which covered Tunisia's coastal plain. Montgomery decided to attack the line by night. The initial assault gained a lodgment, but the tanks of the German Afrika Corps prevented it from being exploited. Spearheaded by fighter ground attack aircraft, Montgomery's tanks then managed to find a way to outflank the Mareth Line. But they were unable to prevent the escape of their old desert adversaries. The Americans, now rejuvenated after the Kasserine disaster, thanks to colourful General George Patton, cleared southwestern Tunisia and linked up with Montgomery. The British Eighth Army continued to advance northwards. The Axis forces were becoming increasingly hemmed in by the British, French and Americans of the First Army, which contained them in the west, while Montgomery pushed from the south towards Wadi Akarit, the next main defence line. His troops successfully stormed this in early April. Again, though, the British were unable to trap the Axis forces. Montgomery pushed on to Enfidaville, where he was again forced to pause. Emphasis now switched to the First Army for the final offensive, which opened on the 6th of May. The Axis forces, their supply lines across the Mediterranean now virtually cut, could hold out no longer. Tunis and Bizerta were entered, and on the 11th of May, all resistance ceased. Over 200,000 Italians and Germans surrendered. The time to re-enter Europe had finally arrived. In January 1943, the Allies had held a major strategic planning conference at Casablanca in Morocco. At it, a decision was made to land on Sicily, once North Africa had been cleared, and bring about Italy's exit from the war. Planning for the Sicily operation began in March 1943. The American Seventh Army under Patton would land on the southern coast and clear the western half of the island, while Montgomery's Eighth advanced up the eastern half. As a preliminary, and after heavy air and sea bombardment, British troops landed on the islands of Lampedusa and Pantelleria on the 11th of June. The amphibious task forces sailed from northwest Africa, Egypt and Britain. The landings on Sicily itself took place on the 10th of July. The operation went largely to plan. The low-grade Italian divisions, mainly defending the coast, were unable to prevent the beachheads from being secured. This was even though Allied paratroops were badly scattered when they were dropped in support of the landings. The Allies now began to advance inland, but met stiff resistance from 2 crack German divisions which had been sent to the island. Eventually, Patton began to make progress as his men swept up to the north coast. The British, however, found it tough going in the more mountainous east. Not until the 5th of August did they enter Catania, halfway up the coast. The Allies, however, were unable to prevent the Germans from slipping across the Straits of Messina to Italy. For the Italians, the loss of Sicily was the last straw. Mussolini was deposed, and they asked for an armistice. Kesselring was ordered by Hitler to guard against an Italian surrender. More German troops were rushed to Italy, which the Allies now prepared to invade. First, Montgomery would cross the Straits of Messina and clear the tow. Then, while he landed further forces at Taranto, the newly formed American Fifth Army, with British troops under command, would land at Salerno. On the 3rd of September, the British crossed the straits and entered the Italian tow. Simultaneously, the Italians secretly signed an armistice. 6 days later, this was publicly announced, and the landing at Salerno went ahead. The Germans rushed in troops and offered stiff resistance. The American Fifth Army had to fight hard to secure the beachhead, with the Germans making fierce counterattacks. The Luftwaffe was also very active and destroyed a number of Allied ships. The ships' guns themselves played an essential role in enabling the troops to get on shore. Eventually, Allied firepower proved overwhelming. The beachhead was expanded and reinforcements landed. Salerno showed, though, that the Germans were not going to give up Italy without a fight. Italy now changed sides, and her fleet sailed to Malta to surrender. The Germans tried to prevent Allied use of the Italian armed forces by disarming them. They also occupied Rome and rushed in more troops from the north. In the meantime, Mussolini was being held captive at a ski resort in the Abruzzi Mountains. On Hitler's orders, troops landed by glider and carried out a daring rescue of the former Italian dictator. They used a light aircraft to take him to safety. He was flown to southern Germany to be reunited with his family and Hitler. Thereafter, Mussolini set up a puppet fascist republic in northern Italy. the German resistance at Salerno was overcome after a week's fighting. This enabled the 5th and 8th Armies to link up. After that, the Americans would advance up the west side of Italy and the British the eastern. Montgomery and 5th Army Commander Mark Clark recognized the need to coordinate their operations. Churchill, though, was keen to re-enter the Balkans by securing the Italian-owned Dodecanese Islands. Landings were made on them in September. The Italian garrisons were disarmed, but lack of naval and air support enabled German troops from Greece to quickly recapture the islands. On mainland Italy, the Allies entered Naples on the 1st of October. Their forces then continued northwards, but were held up by German rearguards. There had been a debate on the German side over whether to base the defense in northern Italy or make the Allies fight for the whole country. In the event, it was Kesselring's latter view which prevailed. Italy's numerous river lines helped Kesselring's strategy. The autumn rains now began to slow the Allies. Conditions deteriorated as winter drew on. Eventually, towards the end of November 1943, the Allies were confronted by the prepared defences of the Gustav Line. This line ran across the country some 75 miles from Rome. Montgomery managed to break through it at its eastern end, but after a fierce battle to capture Ortona, the 8th Army, now exhausted, was forced to halt. Kesselring's strategy was beginning to pay off. Desperate to reach Rome, the Allies now decided to pin down the Germans in the Monte Cassino area and then outflank the Gustav Line through an amphibious landing at Anzio, 60 miles to its rear. This was in spite of previous plans to transfer much of the amphibious shipping to Britain in preparation for the 1944 cross-channel invasion. On the 22nd of January 1944, the now familiar prelude of the naval bombardment covered the approach of the landing craft to the shore. The assaulting troops were quickly ashore. The Germans had been caught largely by surprise and could not prevent the Allies from consolidating their hold on Anzio. These amphibious wheeled vehicles, known as ducks, enabled troops to land without getting their feet wet. Soon, heavy weapons and stores were being put ashore. But as Allied strength in the bridgehead rapidly rose, no effort was made to capitalize on the initial success of the landings by thrusting inland. Meanwhile, on the main front, General Alphonse Juin's French Expeditionary Corps was given the task of assaulting the towering Monte Cassino mountain complex. He opened his attack 2 days after the Anzio landings. At Anzio itself, Allied inactivity gave the Germans time to redeploy their forces in order to eradicate the beachhead. On the 16th of February, they launched the first of a series of furious counterattacks. Soon the Allies were under intense pressure, and the future of the beachhead was put in doubt. The Germans maintained the pressure for 2.5 weeks. They inflicted some 20,000 casualties on the Allies. The situation at Monte Cassino was no better. One attempt after another to seize it failed. In desperation, the Allied air forces bombed the historic monastery on its peak, believing that the Germans were using it as an observation post. The German paratroops defending Cassino remained resolute under constant artillery and air bombardment. French, New Zealanders, Indians and British all tried to capture it, but with no success, although they did manage to capture much of the town at its base. The Allied command had by now hatched a new plan. The bulk of the British 8th Army would be switched from east of the Apennines, Italy's mountainous spine, and a concerted attack launched from Cassino to the Mediterranean coast. In conjunction with this, the forces in the Anzio beachhead would break out towards Rome. As a preliminary, an air offensive, aptly called Strangle, was mounted to throttle the Axis supply routes. The attack was launched on the night of the 11th of May. This time the Poles attacked at Cassino, but were held. Further south, however, the French broke through the Abruzzi Mountains. Kesselring now ordered his troops to begin withdrawing from the Gustav Line. The Poles attacked again at Cassino, which finally fell, and the Allied forces now broke out of the mountains and linked up with the Anzio troops. Rome, which had been such an elusive prize, was entered by the Allies on the 5th of June. They continued the advance northwards, but skillfully handled German rearguards kept the Allies at arm's length. Hopes of preventing the Germans from withdrawing to their next main defense line began to fade. Demolitions were another weapon used by the Germans to hold up the Allies. The hilly terrain of central Italy meant that it was easy to block routes running northwards. By the end of August, the Allied advance had been brought to a virtual halt. They now found themselves facing another strong belt of defences, the Gothic Line, some 150 miles north of Rome. Again, the 8th Army managed to break through this at the Adriatic end, but the endless succession of river lines to its north eventually wore the British down, and they could not achieve a decisive breakout. The Americans beat their heads against the line where it passed through the Apennines. Their advance was also delayed by the Arno line, which protected the western approaches to the Gothic line. Once more, winter had arrived in Italy, and exhaustion gripped the Allied armies. The troops were conscious, too, that the spotlight had turned elsewhere, to northwest Europe and the massive battles on the Eastern Front.